In late August 1944, as Allied forces poured out of Normandy and surged across France, a situation report landed on the desk of General Omar Bradley that immediately raised concern. The frontline markers showed American units operating far beyond the boundaries Bradley believed possible, let alone authorized. At first, his staff assumed the information was outdated or incorrectly plotted. Maps were being revised constantly as the German front disintegrated, and confusion was common. But as additional confirmations arrived, a troubling realization set in. These units were not misplaced. They were exactly where the reports said they were, and they belonged to George S. Patton's Third Army. According to several officers present at the time, Bradley's reaction was blunt and unmistakable. Patton, he said, was not supposed to be there. The advance had moved beyond coordination, beyond planning, and dangerously close to independence. Bradley was no stranger to Patton's methods. The two men had served together since North Africa, and Bradley understood Patton's instinct for speed better than most. Yet what he was seeing in August 1944 went beyond aggressive maneuvering. Patton's armored columns were pushing eastward faster than neighboring Allied formations could keep pace, creating gaps along the front that worried Bradley deeply. The Allied plan relied on cohesion, overlapping advances, secure flanks, and constant communication between armies. Patton's momentum threatened that balance. While his thrusts were devastating German resistance, they also stretched command control to its limits. Liaison officers struggled to maintain contact. Headquarters updates lagged behind reality. In some cases, Patton's leading elements were advancing faster than orders could be issued to support or restrain them. The concern was not theoretical. Bradley feared that Patton's spearheads, operating so far ahead, could be isolated by German counterattacks. Although the German army was reeling, it was not yet destroyed. Intelligence indicated that remnants of panzer divisions were attempting to regroup east of the Seine, seeking opportunities to strike exposed Allied units. A fast-moving force, if cut off from fuel and ammunition, could quickly become vulnerable. Bradley's responsibility was to protect not only Patton's army, but the integrity of the entire Allied advance. Allowing one commander to move too far ahead risked unraveling the coordination that had made the breakout from Normandy possible in the first place. At the same time, Bradley could not ignore the results Patton was achieving. German formations were collapsing faster than expected. Key road junctions and river crossings were being seized before defenses could be established. Prisoners poured in by the thousands, often captured by units that had outrun German intelligence entirely. Reports from the German side described confusion bordering on panic, with commanders unable to determine the true extent of the American breakthrough. Patton's speed was inflicting psychological damage as much as physical destruction. For Bradley, this created a profound dilemma. Every instinct as a commander told him that Patton was creating unacceptable risk. Every battlefield report told him that Patton was winning. By the end of the day, Bradley understood that the issue was no longer Patton's competence, but control. Patton was operating at the edge of Allied command authority, driven by momentum rather than coordination. He was not disobeying orders outright, but he was exploiting every ambiguity, every delay in communication, to keep moving. Bradley knew that if this continued unchecked, higher command would be forced to intervene. The question was not whether Patton had gone too far. It was how long the Allied command could allow him to remain where he was never meant to be. As Bradley studied the evolving situation, the scale of the problem became clearer by the hour. Patton's Third Army was no longer simply advancing faster than planned. It was reshaping the entire front. Units assigned to support neighboring armies were being bypassed, leaving responsibility gaps that no one had formally approved. Reports from corps commanders described Patton's armor appearing unexpectedly on roads thought to be safely behind the front, disrupting German movements, but also surprising Allied formations operating nearby. In several cases, American units encountered Patton's troops without prior coordination. learning only afterward that Third Army elements had already passed through the area. For Bradley, this was a nightmare scenario. Allied success depended on predictability within chaos, and Patton's movements were becoming increasingly difficult to anticipate, even for friendly forces. Bradley's concern extended beyond Patton himself to the reaction this advance provoked elsewhere in the Allied command. British commanders expressed unease about the widening gaps between American armies, fearing that German forces could exploit the lack of cohesion to launch localized counterattacks. Montgomery's headquarters questioned whether Patton's thrusts were aligned with broader strategic priorities, particularly with plans developing for a major push toward Northern Europe. Bradley found himself mediating between admiration for Patton's effectiveness and the political necessity of maintaining balance within the coalition. Allowing one American general to dominate the operational picture risked inflaming existing tensions and undermining Allied unity at a critical moment. Patton, for his part, showed little interest in these debates. His focus remained fixed on the enemy's retreat and the opportunity it presented. He believed the German army was in full collapse and that hesitation would allow it to recover. Every mile gained, in his view, shortened the war and saved lives. When warned that his advance was creating coordination problems, Patton responded by pointing to the results. Roads were open. German resistance was sporadic. Enemy units were surrendering en masse. To Patton, concerns about flanks and boundaries belonged to a slower kind of warfare, one that no longer applied in the fluid conditions of August 1944. Bradley understood the logic, but he also understood its limits. Intelligence reports suggested that German command structures, though damaged, were adapting. Defensive positions were being improvised along rivers and key transportation corridors. The longer Patton remained extended, the more likely it became that German forces could concentrate against isolated elements. Fuel shortages added another layer of risk. Patton's rapid movement consumed supplies at an unsustainable rate, and the further his army pushed east, the longer and more vulnerable its supply lines became. Bradley knew that momentum could vanish overnight if fuel trucks failed to arrive, or if a single counterattack severed a critical route. The tension between speed and control now demanded resolution. Bradley began relaying his concerns upward, emphasizing that Patton's success was becoming strategically destabilizing. This was not a criticism of Patton's ability, but a warning about the consequences of unchecked momentum. The Allied command structure had been designed to manage large-scale coordination, not individual brilliance operating at full throttle. Bradley feared that if Patton continued advancing independently, the Allies risked trading operational coherence for short-term gains. By the end of the week, Bradley reached a reluctant conclusion. Patton could not be allowed to continue at this pace indefinitely. The advance had reached a point where success itself was creating danger. Higher command would have to step in, not to punish Patton, but to impose limits. The realization weighed heavily on Bradley. Slowing Patton might forfeit opportunities that would never return, but allowing him to continue risked consequences that could not be undone. In that moment, Bradley understood that the hardest decisions of the campaign were still ahead. Bradley's warnings did not fall on deaf ears. As reports from the front continued to arrive, Supreme Allied headquarters began to recognize the strain Patton's advance was placing on the broader campaign. Maps at Schaeff showed Third Army units projecting far ahead of adjacent formations, creating an uneven front that complicated planning at every level. Eisenhower was now forced to weigh two competing realities. Patton's speed was accelerating German collapse, but it was also disrupting Allied control. The Supreme Commander understood Bradley's concerns well. Coalition warfare demanded discipline and coordination, not just battlefield success. An advance that could not be synchronized with logistics, air support, and neighboring armies risked turning victory into vulnerability. The first measures taken were subtle. Fuel allocations were adjusted. Priority supply routes were reassigned. Requests from Third Army that would previously have been approved automatically were now delayed or denied. Officially, these decisions were framed as logistical necessities, but their effect was unmistakable. Patton's advance began to slow. Tank crews found themselves waiting for fuel that did not arrive. Reconnaissance units reported open roads and retreating German forces, yet lacked the resources to exploit them. Patton recognized immediately what was happening. To him, the restrictions represented not prudence, but hesitation, the very flaw he believed had prolonged wars throughout history. Bradley monitored the situation closely. He saw that the slowdown was restoring a degree of balance to the front, but he also saw opportunities slipping away. German units that had been on the verge of collapse were now finding time to regroup. Defensive lines, though improvised, began to solidify along rivers and key road junctions. The shock that Patton's speed had delivered was fading. What had been a fluid pursuit was turning into a more conventional campaign, marked by contested crossings and stubborn resistance. Bradley understood that this was the price of control. Momentum, once checked, rarely returned with the same force. Patton refused to accept the imposed limits passively. Even with reduced supplies, he continued probing eastward, launching attacks wherever he sensed weakness. His forces clashed repeatedly with German defenders around Metz and along the Moselle River, encountering resistance far heavier than during the rapid advance across France. These battles revealed both the strength and the vulnerability of Patton's approach. When momentum existed, his methods were devastating. When it vanished, his army faced the same brutal realities as every other formation on the Western Front. Speed alone could not overcome prepared defenses indefinitely. German commanders seized the opportunity. Intelligence reports later revealed that the pause in Patton's advance allowed German units to re-establish command links and concentrate remaining forces. While they could not reverse the Allied breakthrough, they could slow it. Counterattacks, though limited, inflicted casualties and forced Patton's units to fight for ground they might otherwise have swept past. Bradley watched this development with mixed emotions. It confirmed his fears about overextension, but it also underscored what had been lost. The window for an unopposed pursuit had closed. By early September, the situation had crystallized. Patton was no longer operating where he was not supposed to be, but the cost of bringing him back under control was becoming clear. The Allied advance would continue, but at a slower, more deliberate pace. Bradley accepted this outcome, knowing that his duty was to the campaign as a whole, not to any single commander. Yet the question lingered in his mind. Had caution come too soon or too late? Patton's dash had rewritten expectations. Slowing him restored order. But it also marked the moment when the war in the West began to harden into a longer, more costly struggle. Bradley's relationship with Patton remained outwardly professional, but the tension between them never fully disappeared. Bradley respected Patton's instincts and acknowledged his role in breaking German resistance, yet he remained convinced that unchecked speed could have led to disaster. In private, Bradley later reflected that Patton was at his most dangerous and most effective when opportunity aligned perfectly with logistics and coordination. August 1944 had provided that alignment briefly, but not indefinitely. Once the logistical limits were reached, control had to reassert itself. Bradley saw this not as a failure of nerve, but as a recognition of reality. From the German perspective, the moment Patton was slowed marked a turning point. Post-war accounts from German officers described how the American advance initially shattered their ability to respond. Orders arrived too late, defenses were overrun before they could be organized, and entire formations dissolved under the pressure of constant movement. Yet once Patton's pace decreased, familiar patterns returned. Defensive lines stabilized, command structures recovered, and resistance hardened. German commanders understood that they could not win the war, but they could prolong it. The pause imposed on Patton allowed them to do exactly that. Patton never forgave the decision. In his writings and conversations, he argued that the war in Europe could have ended sooner had he been allowed to continue driving east without restraint. He believed the German army in the West was finished in August, and that every day of delay gave the enemy time to recover. Bradley rejected this interpretation. To him, the outcome mattered more than hypothetical possibilities. The Allies crossed the Rhine, defeated Germany, and did so without suffering the catastrophic setbacks that overextension might have invited. In Bradley's judgment, restraint had preserved victory. The episode left a lasting imprint on Allied doctrine. It demonstrated that speed could be decisive, but only within a framework that sustained it. The advance across France forced commanders to rethink assumptions about mobility, logistics, and control in modern warfare. Patton's dash proved what was possible. Bradley's intervention defined what was acceptable. Between those two realities lay the shape of the Allied victory in Western Europe. In the end, Bradley's moment of realization that Patton was already where he was not supposed to be symbolized a broader truth of the campaign. The liberation of France was not achieved by boldness alone, nor by caution in isolation, but by the uneasy balance between them. Patton pushed the limits of what could be done. Bradley ensured those limits were not crossed. Together, their decisions shaped a campaign that moved faster than planned, but not so fast that it fell apart.